So I started all this research when I was just 7 years old. So if any of you have children and they're 7 and they're not doing academic research, you're clearly not pushing them hard enough. But when I was 7 and my sister was 5 years old, I was 2 years older than my sister at the time. And we were playing up on, and I'm 2 years older than her now. But at the time, that meant she had to do everything I wanted to do, and I wanted to play war. So we were up on top of these bunk beds. How many of you had bunk beds growing up? Oh, a lot of you. I loved them. I would still have them now if they were socially acceptable at all. But on one side of the bunk bed, I had all of my G.I. Joe soldiers and weaponry lined up. And on my sister's side, she had all of her My Little Ponies and unicorns lined up for this cavalry charge. And I wasn't too concerned about what was going to happen, because I had won this war every time we had played in the past. And if I was losing, the rules of engagement would change. But there were differing accounts. There were differing accounts of what happened that afternoon. But since my sister was not invited to come speak with you here today, you get to hear the true story. Which is, my sister is a little bit on the clumsy side, and somehow, without any help or push from her loving older brother at all, suddenly Amy disappeared off of the top of the bunk bed and landed with this crash on the floor. And I nervously peered over the side of the bed to see what had befallen my fallen sister, and saw that she landed painfully on her hands and knees on all fours on the ground. Now, I was nervous because my parents had charged me with making sure that Amy and I played as safely and as quietly as possible. And seeing as how I'd accidentally broken Amy's arm just 1 week before this. Don't take her side, you don't know her. But I was trying as hard as I could to be on my best behavior, and I saw on my sister's face, my best friend's face, this wail of pain and suffering and surprise, threatening to erupt from her mouth and threatening to wake my parents from the long winter's nap for which they had just settled. So I did the only thing that my little frantic 7-year-old brain could think to do to avert this tragedy. If you have children, you've seen this hundreds of times before. I said, Amy, wait, please, please, please don't cry. Did you see how you landed? No human lands on all fours like that. She stopped mid-cry with confusion on her face and looked up at me, and I had no idea where else I was going. That was the extent of the strategy. So I blurted out the only other thing I could think of, which is, Amy, I think you're a unicorn. Which was cheating, because there's nothing in the world my sister would have wanted more at that moment to not be Amy, the hurt 5-year-old little sister, but Amy, the special unicorn. Of course, an option that was open to her brain at no point in the past. And you could see on my poor, manipulated sister's face conflict as her brain attempted to devote resources to feeling the pain and suffering and surprise she'd experienced falling off of a bunk bed, or contemplating this newfound identity as a unicorn on the other side. And the latter won out. Instead of crying, instead of ceasing our play, instead of waking my parents with all the negative consequences that were about to ensue for me, instead a smile spread across her face, and she bound right back up onto the bunk bed with all the grace of a baby unicorn with one broken leg. What we had stumbled across at that tender age of 5 and 7, we had no idea at the time, was something that was going to be at the vanguard of a scientific revolution we're living through right now. We're living through twin revolutions right now. Everyone knows about the technological revolution. You see it, we get smartwatches and smartphones. We have information at our fingertips at any moment. The problem is that, well, actually, behind that revolution is actually the one I want to talk about, which is the one I actually think you're leading, but might not actually be as aware of how powerful this revolution actually is. I think it's equally as powerful as the technological revolution. Because of the technology, and that's why we call it a twin revolution, because of that technology, we can now peer behind the curtain to see what the human brain is doing as you're constructing a picture of happiness, or of your world, or of your relationships, or what success looks like. Your brains are incredible. Your brains can process 40 bits of information per second. The only problem is your brain receives 11 million pieces of information every second from your nerve ending. So as your brain is constructing a picture of the world, your brain can actually only process a few snowflakes in the midst of a blizzard. And if you know people that, sometimes we can scan the world for the negatives, the hassles, the complaints, the frustrations. We get stuck in them. Maybe you know people that are like that. Maybe you live with people that are like that. They could walk into any room in the world, anywhere, no matter how beautiful it is, they could walk in that room and they could find something to complain about. Those people are actually not bad people. Their brains are experts at scanning the world for the threats and the negatives first. The problem is, because our brains are limited, what we attend to first becomes our reality. And if our brains are focused on that, we actually literally have no brain resources left over to scan the world for the things we're grateful for in the present moment. The meaning embedded within our lives, the fact that you get to be here at this incredible conference, we're talking about happiness for a brief time this morning. We have access to joy at any moment. And when we start to choose it, what happens is we can actually get other people's brains to start to choose it as well, and it turns on the brain to its highest possible level. What we found is that scientifically, and this is what you know, we just validated it, scientifically, happiness is actually a choice. It's a choice about how your brain decides to allocate those resources. We found that the average person, which you're not, but the average person, they're defined just by their genes and their environment, right? So I could tell you what you were born with or what's going on in your world, and that's pretty much your happiness, because the average person doesn't fight their genes. They don't fight their environment. But what we found is by making small, concrete changes to your life, the Sandra and the you and many of the other speakers have been talking about, these small changes to our life, we can actually trump not only your genes, but 8 decades of experience. Let me just say briefly why that's so important. If you were sitting in a high school science class earlier this week, if your kids were there, they'll tell you, you are your genes and your environment. I believe we're living under the tyranny of that false belief. When you ask somebody why they're not happy, they'll tell you it's their genes or what they were born with. They'll tell you it's their childhood. They'll tell you it's the markets, or they'll tell you it's their debts. They'll tell you all of those externals or their genes, and all of those are true. They're impacting their happiness. But it turns out that if we can get you to make these small positive changes to your mindset and to your habits, which you've already started doing within your own lives and within your own practices, what we found is we can trump those genes and trump those environments, break the tyranny of those two controlling factors over you, and start to actually create that trajectory for yourself, which is amazing. That's the revolution. That's why this research is so powerful. I'm glad you agree, because to me, this is why I feel so passionate about this. When I go around speaking, it's not just about happiness. It's actually trying to show the truth behind this, because it really does set people free to realize that they could actually choose a different type of life in their life. They can choose happiness, and they could actually choose greater levels of success. Now, this research is starting to get out a little bit more. I got this fantastic call from the Harvard Business Review a little over a year ago, and they said, Shawn, we've been following this research about how happiness leads to greater levels of success at companies when people are trying to create their businesses. We're going to put it on the cover of the magazine. I'm like, that's amazing. People work 8 to 18 hours a day. Find some way of getting people happy while they're working. Think what will happen to our communities and to our schools and to our churches and to our synagogues. That would be amazing. I said, but whatever you do, let's make this serious, right? Let's talk about happiness as not just pleasure, because that's how the normal world thinks about happiness. If you talk to them about happiness, they think about happiness that happens when you open up a soda can, or the happiness that you get when you eat a certain type of meal. But what we're talking about, I started actually at the Divinity School. I was studying Christian ethics and comparing it to Buddhist ethics. And part of what we found was the ancient Greeks defined happiness not as pleasure, but I love this. And if you are taking notes today, this is one of the things that changed the pursuit of happiness for me. The ancient Greeks defined happiness as the joy you feel moving towards your potential. I love this definition. It's not pleasure. It's the joy you feel moving towards your potential. Joy is something you can experience even when life is not pleasurable. When you're working long hours to try and build a project or build a business, but you find it to be meaningful, you can feel joy even when there's not high levels of pleasure, even when things are tough. You go for a long run, your legs might be burning, but you can still feel joy, even in the midst of childbirth. Not high pleasure, but sometimes high joy, right? I'm told. So what's amazing about this is that we can quantify those changes now. We can quantify changes to joy and to compassion, but if you link joy, a lot of people outside of this room, they're afraid of happiness, actually. They're afraid of happiness because if they're happy, they might stop pushing so hard. If they're happy, maybe they become complacent within their lives. But you know that that's pleasure. Joy actually fuels us towards our potential. It makes us want to invest more deeply in the world. It makes us want to travel the world to see as much as we can. It makes us want to see what our potential is while we have time on this earth. And what we found is if you link joy with growth together, not only can we quantify it, we can actually sustain it, and we can get it to spread. That happiness was not only a choice, happiness was actually extraordinarily contagious. So I told this to the Harvard Business Review. I said, let's make this serious. We're talking about something that's bending the tracks of human potential. Let's not make it silly. Don't put like a big yellow smiley face or something silly on the cover of the magazine. They said, Shawn, we're the Harvard Business Review. We would never do something like that. I got the cover of the Harvard Business Review. If we could pop up that slide. which some of you probably read, right? And I looked at it, and there was a big yellow smiley face on the cover of the magazine, of course with $ dimples, right? It's Harvard Business Review. But I looked at it, what's wrong with the smiley face? Thank you, no eyes, right? It's blind happiness. They actually replaced it with profits, which I think is funny. But it's blind happiness. It's exactly the problem. Because when we think about happiness, when some people talk about happiness, we think maybe we need to be blind to the suffering we see happening in this world. We have to be blind to the fact that we might be caring for aging parents or for sick children. Blind to the fact that there's racism and discrimination still occurring within our society. But it turns out, you research it, ignorance leads directly away from bliss. What I want to talk about is the exact opposite. What I want to talk about absolutely edifies and validates your approach. What we've been finding, let me tell you briefly. So I was out speaking to a group of CEOs last year, all CEOs of top software companies out in Northern California. One of the CEOs of this software company offered to drive me to the airport after my talk to talk about how he could cascade this research out throughout his entire global company, which I was so excited about. We've been testing these little digital interventions and in-person trainings to see how much change we could get. So I got into this guy's really nice sports car, put on my seatbelt. He got on the other side, immediately started talking to me about how their company's been growing so quickly that their stress levels have been rising. And while he was telling me this and speeding towards the airport, that little bell was going off on the car, the seatbelt bell. And eventually it stopped going off. It got tired. And I turned to him and I said, you don't wear seatbelts? And he said, no, Shawn, I listened to your talk. I love your research. I'm an optimist. I was like, oh, no. No, you're an idiot. But I'd love to work with you. Optimism is great for a lot of things, right? But it doesn't stop cars from hitting us. It doesn't stop bad things from happening to us in our lives. There's an incredibly optimistic room here. But it doesn't mean that you're immune from bad things happening to your life or bad things happening to your families. That's irrational optimism. And if we sugarcoat the present, we make bad decisions for the future, and people stop believing in our beliefs. They stop believing in our leadership. What I want to talk about is what sociologists call rational optimism, which is you. Rational optimism doesn't start with rose-colored glasses. Rational optimism starts with realism. It starts with a realistic assessment of the present, but maintains the belief that your behavior matters. Rational optimism starts with realism, but maintains the belief that your behavior matters. The reason why that's important is it helps people avoid those two pitfalls. And you can see it amongst your friends or spouses. Some people, they don't see any of the problems. They don't see any of the negative. They sugarcoated the present, and they don't fix any of those problems in their life. They don't see anything they need to, so they create false happiness, and then after a while, it just starts to dissolve. On the other side, you see people that see all the problems. They see all of them, but they think that they're permanent and that they affect everything. What we found is rational optimists, they actually find that middle path. They see the problems, but they think that they're local, that they're one part of their reality, and that they're temporary. I want to tell you about that real quickly. So the difference between optimism and pessimism, just yesterday, they were like, well, pessimists are great because they see the problems we need to fix. That's not true at all. Optimists and pessimists can both equally see problems. What causes you to be an optimist or pessimist is after you've seen the problem. After you see the problem, if you see a problem and you think it's permanent, pervasive, you're a pessimist. If you see a problem and you say, that's only one part of my reality, but look at all the other good things that are going on in my reality, and that this negative, this too will pass if I apply my behavior and connect to the right people, that makes you an optimist and a rational optimist, one that actually creates these positive changes over and over and over again. That's you. So part of what I want to do is when we find people choose rational optimism, something different happens in the research. I'm not going to go too much into the research today because you already get this. A lot of it is common sense, but I want to show you something that I think is really special about this. But I have to start in a terrible place. I know I'm speaking at this incredible conference. Like, there's so much energy. It's been amazing. The worst mistake you can make as a speaker right now would be to start your talk with a lot of graphs or data or research. Where I'd like to start us with is a graph. This graph looks boring, right? But this graph is the reason that I get excited and wake up every day, which means I live a very, very exciting life. Especially because that's a fake graph. I found it on Google Images. I have no idea what they were graphing. But the reason I love this graph is because it shows us why science is so wrong about you. Because if I got this data back studying the people that are gathered here right now, I would be thrilled. Because look, there's very clearly a trend going on here, and that means that I can get published, which is all that really matters. The fact that there's one weird red dot that's up above the curve, there's one weirdo in this room. Oh, and you know who you are. I think there's a lot of weirdos in this room. That's no problem. That's no problem because I can delete you. I can delete you because you're clearly a measurement error. And I know that you're an error because you're messing up my data. One of the very first things we teach people in business and economics and statistics and government courses is how, in a statistically valid way, can we eliminate the weirdos? How do we eliminate those people that are not like our average, right? Because that's what normal society cares about. They want to find out how many pills the average person should take if they get a headache. But already you should start to see a problem. Regardless if you're 90 pounds or 290 pounds, the back of the bottle still says 2 pills. That's impossible. We metabolize in completely different ways, but we've gone right towards the average with safe, effective dosing, which we should there. But as soon as you start asking questions you've come here to ask, how we can raise our levels of energy and productivity and leadership and optimism and hope, all of those are human potential questions. Ask them with the same lens. Turns out we create what you've seen outside of eWomen's Network. We create what we call the cult of the average. If I ask a question like, how fast can a child learn how to read here in Texas? Scientists change the answer to, how fast does the average child learn how to read here in Texas? So then we tailor the classes right towards the average, forgetting the fact that many of us read slower than the average or much faster than the average. Fall below average at a company, traditional psychologists, and you've probably seen this, they get thrilled because that means you're either depressed or you have a disorder or hopefully both. We're hoping for both because the business model was if you come into a therapy session with one problem, maybe you've seen this, you come into a therapy session with one problem, they want to make sure you leave knowing you have 10 problems. Right? They'll go all the way back into your childhood and prove this to you, but eventually the role of traditional psychology has been, how do we make everyone normal again? But normal is statistically average. And what I argue, what positive psychology argues, is instead of deleting the weirdos, we study you. You're weird, right? It's Sunday morning. You're hearing a talk on the science of happiness. You're looking at how you can actually change your life with your conscious decisions. You're actually choosing to not be part of the cult of the average. We want to study you instead of deleting you. And by studying the outliers, what we found is information, not how to move people up to the average, but how we can move the entire average up in our companies and our schools worldwide. You're the key to this because we need people to actually take this research and make it come to life. So part of what I would love to do is to do a brief experiment with you here today. We're not going to do it quite, let me just tell you really quickly. That graph I put up there, the reason that's so important to me is that that's not the message most people's brains normally get. If you turn on your smartphone to find out what's going on in the world right now, your brain is immediately bombarded by negative information, right? Murder and corruption and diseases and natural disasters and deflated balls, and very quickly your brain starts to think, gosh, that's the accurate ratio of negative to positive. I can come to a conference like this and hear and be surrounded by all these positive people, but let's get back to reality. Realities must be all suffering because that's what we see on the news. We see the shootings. We don't see people getting married. We don't see the babies being born. We find out when the babies are not born in the right way, right? So in our brains, we see a lot of broken bridges, but they never actually get fixed. It changes us. How many of you, I'm curious in this room, how many of you over the past 3 years have actually decreased the amount of news you've consumed because you felt like it had a negative effect? Look around the room. It's stunningly high, right? And it's not an ostrich approach. You're not hiding from the world. You're just trying to stem the flow because what you've intuited is it's creating what we call the medical school syndrome, which if you know people have been through medical school, if you've been through it, during the first year of medical school, as you read through a list of all the symptoms that can happen to a human being, suddenly these brilliant and aspiring doctors start realizing they have all of those symptoms and diseases. They'll actually start manifesting the symptoms they were studying for an exam. If you get bored during my talk, just go on WebMD and just start going through different diseases, and it becomes like a checklist. It's like dead hands. That's what I was feeling while he was talking. But what's amazing, I have a brother-in-law actually named Bobo, which we don't have time for here today. Bobo married Amy the unicorn and became a pediatrician. So it's perfect. Bobo called me on the phone from Yale Medical School, which is Harvard's rival, and he said, Shawn, I have leprosy. Which even at Yale is extraordinarily rare. But I had no idea how to console poor Bobo because he had just gone over an entire week of menopause. What we're finding is not necessarily the reality that shapes us, right? It's the lens through which we view reality that changes how it affects us. And if you're looking for the symptoms and diseases, it turns out you start actually believing them and becoming them. What we found is if we can change that lens, we can move people in a positive direction.